Alright, here I am making the Levain or Levains for mixed day the following day. This is what I call Levain day. This is where I feed my starter, I make my Levains, I make the scald, and I do my inclusion prep. On this video, you will see me feeding the starter, doing the Levains, and I did not include the inclusion prep because it's pretty self-explanatory, and it's different for any inclusions you might want. However, let's get into it. This starter is 60% hydration, which will be the same formula as the Levain, which will also be 60% hydration. And I'm doing about a 1 to 5 to 3 ratio. Sometimes that ends up being a higher ratio, especially when somebody calls me for a pizza gig, like after I already, did this part. So I won't have as much starter to make a lower ratio. Anyway, I feed about 1 to 5 to 3, making 60% hydration from 60% hydration starter. I do 90% high gluten flour, which is King Arthur Sir Lancelot. It's unbleached, unbromated. 5% whole wheat flour and 5% rye flour. That's both for flavor, consistency, and kind of the fermentation properties that you get from those whole grains and having something that's different than wheat. And it doesn't necessarily matter the order you go in the mixer, but out of habit I go water starter flour, and then I just mix till it's incorporated. I'm not going for any kind of gluten development here. So it's about 7 minutes on speed 1, maybe even, I usually set a 5-minute timer and see how it looks. I usually end up around 7 minutes by the time I feel a comfortable incorporation without too much gluten development. But yeah, I portion into each batch, so I have control over each one in terms of temperature, in terms of rise percent. And I portion the starter. I actually do that first, and I do not oil or put any fat on that vessel. I just throw it straight in, and as you can see, like this is me getting the starter out that had no oil or fat on it. It takes a little more work, but it's worth it, and it makes sure that my actual starter never has any oil or fat involved, where the Levains will be used in the batch of dough and never to be seen again. So those, I do oil those vessels or bus tubs, if that helps you make sense of what I'm saying. And I do try to get every little bit, because the way my spreadsheet is set up is that this exact gram amount of starter I had on hand will go in and make an exact amount of Levains and starter for the next group that I need. And at this rate right now, I am feeding my starter about twice a week. I am not feeding my starter every day and keeping it at room temperature. I think if you have a very strong active starter, that is a myth that you need to keep doing that. However, when you're building your starter, you absolutely need to feed it once to twice per day until it's very active, which can take 1 month. I went 3 months before I ever threw mine in the fridge. And that was the 5% rye and 5% whole wheat I just dumped in. And I'm setting the timer to 5 minutes, and I'm going to mix on speed 1, the slow setting. And this is it. It's 90% incorporated. I give it a few spins in the mixer, and then it's good to go. And unfortunately, it looks like I did build some gluten with that pumpkin shape, but also when it's stiff, it kind of just comes together like that. I would bite the bullet on any flour you have around the rim if you're ever doing what I'm doing, and do a little less in each of your Levains and starter, because all that means is you really just need a little more time. But yeah, even at 60% hydration, you can see this mixer kind of skip, showing that it's a little taxing, but it's still better than, a 50, 55, 45% stiff starter or biga. Yeah, so besides this and inclusion prep. The scald is next, and I'm about to get into that pretty soon. While this footage plays of me kind of portioning the starter and then all of the Levains, I'll explain the scald. So a scald is the act of gelatinizing the starches in flour, which actually does happen in the cooking process. For instance, you basically gelatinize starches and then caramelize starches once you get the color on them finally. But if you take a portion of your flour before mixing and gelatinize the starches and then add it to your mix, you can end up with something that lasts longer, has its own kind of unique sweetness. It will also allow more water into the recipe because, as you'll see, I'm going to do 100% hydration scald. And once it's done being, quote, kneaded, it will seem as if it's like 50% hydration. I call this bread that I make Japanese Yudane. It's a Japanese milk bread with my kind of twist. It's not any traditional exact recipe, but it does use the Japanese Yudane scald as comparable to a tongjang. The main difference, they both gelatinize the starches, but a Yudane is 100% hydration, where a tongjang would be 500% hydration. So you're turning what would be basically a cream into a batter by the time it's done. I do prefer the Yudane myself. I just think it's easier to get much closer to the 65 degrees Celsius that's required. Because if two things are the same weight, you can basically go by the temperature difference. For instance, I can get my water to 90 degrees Celsius if my flour is around 25 degrees Celsius, because that difference will be 65, meaning the average or mass of the dough will be 65 degrees Celsius, which is conveniently right where starch is gelatinized. So here I'm portioning all of my Levains, going to put lids on them, throw them in the fridge until the end of the night. Basically, when I get back from the gig and I got to wash my dishes anyway, all I got to do is pull out these Levains and the starter in the morning. The starter's ready to stay in the fridge for the half a week, 3-4 days until it's going to be fed again. Would be good for a week if need be. Anyway, here's the act of actually making the scald. Pour in the water. I throw myself a temp probe in it and watch it get to 90 degrees Celsius. I make sure to have everything in place. There's always something missing, but I try my best. So it's 90 degrees Celsius. I dump my flour that's room temperature in there. I give it somewhat of a stir to bring it together. And then once it looks like, it's somewhat incorporated, I'll dump it on the table and with some gloves to protect my hands from being scalded. I knead it into incorporation. I also make sure to use my bench knife to help myself from having an annoying mess to clean up. So every few kneads or so, I will grab my bench scraper and kind of just clean up as I go. This helps not have this mush kind of stick to the wood bench here. There's no real gluten forming here, so it's not a long process. I kind of overdid it to just show you guys, how you can do it. You throw it in a KitchenAid mixer if you want to. You can have a different kneading style if you want. But yeah, my best advice is kind of to clean as you go. And if you have some hot and soapy water, you can throw your pan in there to get whatever flour is there. But you do want to knead this till it's incorporated, cut it up into smaller pieces, let it cool to room temperature, uncovered, then cover it and give it 8 to 24 hours in the refrigerator until it's time to mix your dough. And this is 100% hydration of a scald, and you can see it looks like 45 to 50% hydration. So this is a good example of how you can get more water into your dough. this Japanese milk bread is 85% hydration, but looks and feels like 70 to 75 in the end. Anyway, thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe. Glad to be back. Love you guys.